Good morning and welcome to Radio Friends on Friday, January the 18th. My friend Larry Brown is with us, singer, songwriter, and storyteller. Today, it's the Storyteller hat, right?
It's the Storyteller hat.
And are we dealing with Martin Luther King Day, which is Monday?
Well, it will associated values, let's say it that way. But this is a historical, this is not fantasy, not fiction. This is the facts.
Okay. And I like to give the title to the story, but this one I'm going to let Larry just go ahead and give the title. It's a long one, and I'd mess it up.
Well, this weekend, our country is emphasizing values like justice and equality and freedom as we anticipate celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. Day on Monday. And I want to share this little short Missouri history story because I think some of those values surface as we hear this story. And I'm calling it Mule Shoes, Boodlers, Holy Joe, and the Missouri Idea.
Mule Shoes,
Boodlers,
Holy Joe,
and the Missouri Idea.
And the Missouri Ideas. Okay, that's the name of the story. Here's Larry Brown.
Well, from the 1890s into the first couple of decades in St. Louis, they had a serious issue with gang violence and political corruption. Now, all of that began to come to an end with a series of trials that were held 1901 to 1904. But it began really with the arrest and conviction of a man whose name was Colonel Edward Boss Butler, who ran a kind of a syndicate of corrupt business people and political leaders that were called the Big Cinch. Well, Butler had gotten his start by making and distributing and servicing mule shoes for the mules who pulled the streetcars in St. Louis. And he started using bribes to get the most lucrative of contracts. Well, he discovered, of course, that you could make more money receiving the bribes than you could giving the bribes. Now, in those days, bribes were called boodles. And so the person who may give or receive were boodlers. Well, Butler found that he set up these liveries in these stables, and he was amassing a fortune. And using then the profits from the boodles, he was able to get into Democratic politics in the city of St. Louis and managed to start controlling elections from the ward precinct level all the way up to City Hall, and involving, again, this cartel of business leaders and politicians. In fact, they were called together the Big Cinch. And sometimes even Butler used some of the street gangs as his enforcers. One of the more famous was run by Bad Jack Williams and the Bottoms Gang. Now, this system began to be dismantled, however, by the appearance of a young lawyer who originally came from Tennessee. His name was Joseph W. Folk. And he had come to work in a law firm with his uncle in St. Louis, and partly because of his Baptist background, but more importantly, in his job as an attorney, he was using moral principles to guide legal decisions and political administration, and he earned the nickname of Holy Joe. Well, Holy Joe started and then was president for a while of a young men's Democratic club in St. Louis called the Jefferson Club. And he gained some reputation and admiration because he was a significant mediator in a pretty violent, murderous streetcar strike in 1900 in St. Louis. Well, out of his popularity as a mediator, his work with the Jefferson Club, people started encouraging him to run, and he did, and was elected district attorney. And he began then a series of trials against this corruption that had made its way all to the top of St. Louis's administration. And he was bringing folks up on bribery charges, et cetera, et cetera. Well, a part of his support came from a journalist by the name of Lincoln Steffens. Now, some of you may recall that he is often identified as the first of the muckraker journalists. Well, he published an article called Tweed Days in St. Louis, which was a reference to Boss Tweed in New York City. And it was published in McClure magazine in 1902. And then in 1904, he had kind of a summary of a lot of his stories, which was published also, called Shame of the Cities. And this got Joseph Folk's attention nationally. In fact, he was beginning to be respected and heard about as his proceeding through these trials that he was conducting as district attorney, and even earned the respect and admiration of Republican Teddy Roosevelt. Well, as Holy Joe Folk proceeded through these trials, his reputation gaining, folks encouraged him then to run, and he was elected the 35th governor of Missouri. Now, some identify Holy Joe as part of the progressive era, but he went on to significantly influence legislation in Missouri, such things as, of course, anti-bribery laws, child labor laws. He at that time ended racetrack gambling, but he established agricultural boards, food regulation, and helped establish the Missouri Library Commission. Well, that whole package of progressive reform and legislation giving the public oversight morally over governance was called the Missouri Idea. And this spread to other states, and it was seen, this package of reform surely should work. Well, we can look back now and say his legacy was very important. Now, unfortunately, I think his insistence on morality kept him from running for Missouri governor a second term in 2 unsuccessful bids for the U.S. Senate. He was appointed by President Wilson to be a solicitor for the State Department in handling transportation affairs. He died in 1923 at the age of 54. Many said he worked himself to death. And for Boss Butler, the Missouri Supreme Court overturned his conviction. He died in 1911. But we look back and say that legacy of justice, of freedom, equality, particularly giving moral principles to public oversight of governance, is something we should treasure. And of course, it was important then, and I must add, it seems to be needed even more today.
Yes.
Holy Joe and the Missouri Idea. And now, if you want to read more about that, there's his biography written in 1997 as a part of the Missouri Biography series by Stephen Piatt, written in 1997. You can read about Holy Joe and the Missouri Idea.
But you're telling me that some of the stands that the state of Missouri took back then were adopted by other states.
Oh, yes. In some ways, we were a trend setter. But sure, there was a part of that progressive era turn of the 20th century.
We used to be a bellwether state, too.
Well, yes.
All right, Larry Brown, if people want more information on Larry Brown, your website is?
brownstory.com.
Okay. Got CDs, and he'll be happy to come and tell a story for you. Thank you so much for coming by. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.